What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and today we're going to be going over adding the rest of the attacks to our input buffer. So we have all of our commands, all of our sequences in the input buffer already. We even have our standard attacks now, like our neutral attacks for light, mid, or light, medium, heavy, and special. But one thing we don't have are state-based attacks. So these are your directional attacks, like forward, medium, your crouching attacks, and those sort of things. Those are the states that we don't actually have in the input buffer. We can access them by, in our state machine, we have transitions from walking forward to that specific attack that we want to use. And that works fine, and honestly that probably will work fine the entire time. I don't foresee that being any issue throughout the series. However, there's some additional things we can do and some ways to make our lives more convenient by just determining exactly what attack we're going to do from the code. And you can see this by, if I am to be standing and do my neutral medium like this, I just use the medium attack. If I'm walking backward, it actually doesn't print anything. That's because of some of the logic I have today. I haven't set up the backward medium yet on purpose so that I can show you the difference. So the code doesn't know what attack we're going to be using. It knows we're going to be using the medium attack when I press the E key in my case, but we're in the walking backward state, so it doesn't exactly know what command is going to be executed. However, I've set up the forward medium, and now it knows that the forward medium command is the one that's going to be executed. This is good for two reasons that I can think of. One, this will automatically populate our move list. We won't have to fake any data or anything like that. And if we update the input buffer and command lists, then it's automatically going to update on the menu. And I'm referring to when you can go to the move list menu and go through all of your commands that the character has. That will be fully just controlled by the actual logic in the game, which does make it nicer, especially as you get more characters, more moves, or if you want to change the inputs. You don't have to go and change anything related to these attacks in the game or in the data, which is going to make it a lot nicer, a lot more convenient. A few other things that it could be used for are just general ease of use in the code. Now we'll know exactly what type of command we're going to be using, regardless of state. This is important because some games will require you, or excuse me, will allow you to perform like this. This is technically our forward medium. You can see just by pressing them at what is essentially the same time, as long as it's one frame apart, I can go directly into that that attack. It doesn't require you to start walking first and blend first to do so. So we don't have too much to do today in terms of the actual logic to make this work, but I think this is going to be something that's going to really wrap up a lot of the ambiguities between the stuff we did before the input buffer and after, because we have kind of remnants of both, and we really want to swap everything over to using the input buffer and command list system. First things first, this is episode 107, so if you've not been following along, I'll link the playlist right here in the top right corner. We still have plenty of episodes to go, and there's a new episode every Sunday, but if you'd like to check all the ones out prior, or if you'd like to skim through what we've done so far, feel free to click that. Otherwise, I will post the first episode to the input buffer series. I know this one comes up in the iCards a lot, but it's important. It's where we got our start for all of our input buffer command list stuff, and we've been building off of it ever since. Alright, and now it's time to get started. So, there's really only two things that we're going to have to do today in the code, and one of which is we're going to need to add this required state variable to the F command structure. So if you look at our .h class, we have all sorts of stuff, all sorts of enums, and one of the enums that we have is the character state enum, and it determines what the character is doing. It is separate from the combo state. Doesn't have anything to do with combat. It's specifically what the player is choosing to do. So if they're choosing to block, jump, move left or right, and run left and right. Now, with this, there was something I wanted to cover before we go any farther, and that's move right and move left, and same with run right and run left, even though we haven't executed them yet, really should be adjusted now. Just like in our input type, we changed left and right to forward and backward. We're going to do the same thing in this enum. we know now that our commands can work on either side, but we want to make sure that they're swapped accordingly depending on our, what direction we're facing. So to do that, we don't want to say right or left anymore. It'll get confusing when you're trying to think, okay, it has to be right. Really, we want to say forward and backward. So let's do it that way. So change moving right to moving forward if you haven't already. I know it's a simple change, and it's taken us this long to do it, but we're going to start using this character state in the commands. And so we don't want to make this any more confusing than it has to be. So I have moving forward and moving backward, and I've changed the actual text as well for them. And we don't have to do this for the running if you don't want to, because we don't actually have running states yet. We have the dashing, but that's different than running. Running would be a continuous, you are able to run, in a running state. So if you'd like, and if you plan on using them, I would go ahead and just change them as well. Again, not required that you do this. You could also do it later if you don't feel like dealing with it now. But I would recommend that you do end up doing this just, again, to get rid of any confusion. It's pretty annoying to think of left and right and if we're flipped or not. And I know sometimes we have to, but for something like this, we don't. Our commands are going to be based on what direction we are facing. And, that changes the inputs that we have to use. So it's cut and dry. Are we forward or backward? It doesn't really matter if we're moving right or left. So after that change, I am going to stop this because when I build, I'm going to get errors, considering I was using those enum values. So I'm going to live fix this with you. I don't like changing names of things and then not showing you the live fix. I think that can be confusing. I do put in everything beforehand if it's additions I've made and, things like that to different functions and variables. But to actually change a name is very confusing when you're used to seeing it. So just understand, I'm going to go through this list really quickly. It'll be really easy. You could do a find and replace if you want, but let's just go through it one at a time so you can kind of be familiar with everything that we had done. All right, so the first thing we're going to update is our jump function. So before we were jumping a specific direction, whether we were moving left or right, regardless if it's forward or backward, and that's honestly perfectly fine, but changing this name and using it differently, using it as forward and backward, will screw up this logic if we want to specifically go left or specifically go right. Now, what we can do is this. We can add an additional check for anywhere we're going to update the logic. So think about it like this. We were checking before if the character state is moving left. So if the character was moving to the left, we were just applying force to the left. We didn't really care if it was a forward jump or a backward jump. We just knew that we were going to be jumping in a direction that was going to be left. And so now what we want to do is this. We don't care if it's forward or backward. So we have to do two checks. We say either if character state is moving forward and not is facing right, because if they're facing to the left and they're moving forward, that is going to be a left jump. And that'll get us the same logic that we want. Or what we can do is we can check if the character state is equal to the character state moving backward and is facing right. That means we'd be jumping backward, but regardless, it would be to the left. Now, what we can do is copy this logic. So I put in my other parenthesis there, don't forget that. We can basically copy this entire thing, and we're going to reverse the roles. This previously was a right jump. So no matter what, if we're moving backward or forward, we need to know that we're jumping to the right. So if we're moving forward and we are facing right, that's a right jump. If we're moving backward and we're not facing right, then that's a right jump. The else can stay the same because that is the static jump. Let's build again, and we'll go to the next set of errors. See, you can tell there's not that many. The other ones are going to be in move right and move right controller. This specifically is move right. All of this access logic was for charge attacks and for releases and things like that. You can skip down to where we actually go and set our character state. Now here is the same thing. We had already this is pressing backward boolean, which can say, if you want, the is pressing backward boolean is mainly to determine if you know, we're pressing that direction regardless if we can move there. So if you're in block stun, we still want to be able to go to that sort of thing. However, here specifically, we don't actually need the Boolean anymore because we could check above all of this logic to do that. So what we need to do is check the direction that we're moving before setting this character state. We don't want to just set it as soon as we get into this if statement where we check the value anymore. So to do that, I'm going to actually just cut it, check here, and then we're going to use this logic here. So instead of where we were setting is pressing backward, instead of just doing that, we're going to actually set our character state here, which is going to be moving backward. Else, we're going to add an else now, and we're going to say moving forward. Just like that. So essentially, value greater than 0.01 is the right direction. So if we're not facing right, then we're moving backward. We're moving to the right, but we're not facing right, so that's backward. Else, we're moving right and we are facing right, so that's forward. And we're going to do the same thing here. Very simple. Okay, so instead of moving left, whoops. Instead of moving left, if the value is less than negative 0.01, that's a value being input in the left direction, and they are facing right, so that would be pressing backward, so that would be moving backward. Else, in this case, the character state is going to be moving forward. All right. And now you can see how this works. The is pressing backward stuff, again, was used for other things. It's really used for determining if we're blocking and without moving and things like that. So for move right logic, it should be pretty much exactly the same thing. We never actually updated it in the other function because we haven't touched on the controllers again. We only updated the standard move right, not move right controller. So move right controller, you can actually copy all of move right, everything in here, and then you can actually paste it in to move right controller, just like that. The only thing you'll want to do is you will want to update your dead zones if you had them. So for me, my dead zones on move right controller were 0.2 as opposed to 0.01. So you'll want to make sure that you put those back. If you do copy and paste like I did, and there you go. The rest of the logic will be exactly the same for controllers at the moment. Again, there will be other logic that goes into it later on when we get into more advanced controller stuff. Specifically with quarter circles and those types of inputs, they're going to be a little bit different on an axis than they are with just standard keys. Okay, also in move right, make sure you do this, is very important. Just like we always have in the past, the way we determine if the game is using a controller or keyboard or basically a device that can support multiple players is this if base game instance is device for multiple players Boolean. We want to make sure that if we're using controllers, that is disabled. So if not base game instance, just like that, is device for multiple players, or basically this is not a device for multiple players, meaning it is an individual controller or input device. But there you go. Once you fix up move right controller, you'll be at the bottom of the list here, and the build should succeed. With the build being able to succeed, you can see that we only had to change the enum in a few places. So now you're good to go. Instead of saying move right and move left, we now have moving forward, moving backward, and then same with running forward and running backward. With the character state, I recommend that you add a crouching state as well as not just the Boolean, and do the same thing we did with moving forward, moving backward. We will be doing a little bit more with this in the future, so you don't have to worry about too much for now. But we already have jumping. We should have crouching. That way we can just add we can check for the crouching state, and when light attack gets used, then it goes to the crouching light as opposed to doing it by the states, just like we did with the moving here and the directional attacks here. There you go. Now back to what we were doing before we had to make that change is going to the F command structure. So the F command structure is how we set up everything in our command list, all of our different commands that we have. So this ranges from standard light attacks, so your neutrals, to special attacks, to actual commands that you have to input. So, you know, if I have to do backward, forward, light punch, then that also goes into the F command structure. Well, we want to update this now to where we have an additional parameter here. And we want to have another variable that's called required state or something along those lines. And essentially this is going to check the character state when this command is able to be performed. So the correct inputs have been entered and we're ready to use it. Is the character in a state where they can use it? And this is important because if you're pressing your neutral, medium, great, you know, perform neutral, medium. But if you have another input that has the exact same set of parameters to perform, so say I have another command and it's just backward, medium, and I'm walking backward already, we should perform that command. So we don't want to have to set up a priority order and fight between these two when we could just check the character state. If that's the only move, if that move can only be done while walking backward and pressing medium, it shouldn't have to fight against the standard neutral medium. So the state is going to check the character state when the inputs were pressed, and then it will determine if it's valid or not. You could also, if you wanted to, put it in the F command input, and each individual input that was pressed by the player would have to have the character in the correct state, but I don't see a point in that. At least I am not aware of one where you would have to be that specific. But just know it is open to you. If you have a need for it, you could end up using it. So once you add that to your F command, we're going to use it in one of the places here coming up. So if you scroll down to where we have our check input buffer for command using type function right here, then we do all this crazy logic in here that you've seen in all the past episodes. We're going to leave almost all that alone today. The only thing we're going to update is the actual ending part when a command is found. So previously in the series, you would have seen these two lines and these two lines right here. So you'd have this if correct sequence counter equals -1 and it's not on a release. Basically, we were checking to see if it was a negative edge command or not. We haven't done negative edge, but this is really, we're making sure that none of them are negative edge right now. So we're saying, oh, if it's a release, we're just ignoring it. And then we were checking to see if the correct number of inputs and the valid inputs have been matched to a command. If so, we were adding it to the move buffer, and then we were breaking out of this. Well, that's fine to do. However, we don't want to add moves now that are in the wrong state for that command. We don't want to add potential commands that we can use if they're in the wrong state, because that would mean that, again, we'd have to compare against neutral medium to, say, backward medium, which they should never have to compete. It'll eliminate bugs by not having to determine which one we should use, and it'll also improve performance because there's no reason to check against them or add them to the buffer and clear them up. So all we do now is, instead of just doing move buffer.add and add the command, we have an additional if check now to make sure that the character state, this is just the standard state of the character, is equal to the current command.required state, which is the new variable that we added. Else, we reset the correct sequence counter just like we do above, because we want to skip this command. So we reset it saying, nope, don't use this, and then it'll eventually fall out and then go to the next command. You could also break if you wanted to, but if you want it to keep searching the circular input buffer, you can allow it to do so just by resetting the correct sequence counter. Okay, and then after that, all we have to do is, you don't have to change anything in your determine command to use, because right now we don't have priority order, but we do go off of the most complex. Even if they're the same complexity, they now won't be added to the move buffer unless the state is correct. And so you won't have any issues between that. It'll always know which state to pick. And then if you go to tick, there is one thing we should do to clean up our input buffer a little bit, something I actually never touched on because I just forgot about it, quite frankly. But when we updated our circular input buffer to support multiple inputs on the same frame, we never updated the tick function where we were creating this none input if the user had not input any, well, inputs. If they hadn't pressed any buttons or performed any actions, we were setting circular input buffer cur tick inputs 0 to none input. But that would only ever set the first input of that frame, which we don't want any lingering data here. So we should make sure that we loop through max inputs per frame and then set it to be inputs I equals none input. So everything in this input gets, in this input buffer on that tick gets completely reset. And that's what we want. We don't want any lingering data, regardless of if it was the first, second, third, however many input on that frame. Now with that done, we can go back into the engine. There's actually not much we're going to have to do in here to make this work, but we are going to have to add a command for all of our states that we want to work using this. So if we don't want to do the actual directional attacks just in the NMBP anymore, all we have to do is make a command, set up our required state, and then check that command in our state machine. Okay, so now that this has loaded, if you take a look, let's open up the NMBP for the character. You will have a few errors because we renamed the moving right, moving left. That's okay. And then go do your mutant BP as well. Now the mutant BP should be compiled fine. Make sure that your base character BP is as well. You'll notice mine's not because of the same thing we just spoke about. So this error in the base character BP is for pushing the character, and it's because we are using the character state, but it's still using the moving left and the moving right. So all this really wanted to do was determining if we were pushing into the character one direction or another. So it doesn't matter what our actual enums are as long as they are forward and backward. That'll be enough. And then we have to know if we are facing a certain direction, what offset to give the player that is being pushed. So you don't have to actually change anything here. You literally just select the forward and backward enums now as opposed to left and right. All right. Again, mutant BP should build properly. So now what we can do is set up all of our other commands that we want. So I have forward medium. That's the one we already set up prior. And I selected medium attack as the only input that is required. It's a press, no charge frames. But the required state is moving forward. All the other things are default. And then you can make your own as many as you want. So if you want to add a new one, you just hit the little plus next to your character commands. And then open up the new one. We can call this one backward medium. Add a new input type. It's going to be medium as well, medium attack. It's going to be a press. It's going to be moving backward. This is the index here. So we have index 13 and index 14 are these backward and forwards for these mediums. Now if we go into our NMBP, we can go into the state that we want to be able to perform this from. So previously what we were doing is we had a walking forward to directional attack medium right is what this node stands for. But really, just think of this as the forward medium attack. And how we were doing it before is just checking this Boolean. Again, it's clean, it worked, but it won't automatically go to command lists. And so we would have to manually put in data to show players what moves they could use and things like that, which is a little strange. It's a little bit more convenient just to do it this way. This is the standard method that we use for all of our attacks. So if you've watched other ones, you'll know we do that. But just as an example, idle to light attack is the same thing. You can copy this from any of your other commands. All you have to do is you get your character reference, you grab their list of commands, you get the index of this specific move, see if the character should be using it or not, and if they should, we go into it. That's what we're doing for this state too. So walking forward to our forward medium. It's that simple. Okay. Now, for the walking backward to the, let me see if I can get the state here. They all kind of blend together. Walking backward to the directional attack medium left, or basically walking backward to medium left, or backward left. So this is what it looks like now, but what we can do is very easily change this. Don't have it copied, but that's okay. Character reference. We're going to get our command list. We're going to get a reference. You could do a copy as well here. It doesn't really matter, but we are going to set the one variable on other spots, so that's why I usually do the reference. And then you're going to actually just, you can choose the index that you want. I know for me, my backward medium is index 14, so that's the index that I put in. And then I just say break command. You can open this up by hitting the down arrow. And at this point, you should know what to do. You just bring over has used command into the result. And now you'll see that I disconnected the old logic. Okay, this was the old logic. And then we'll test that in a second. We do have to fix up the errors for walking forward and backward because we changed the name again. So let's go into this. So idle to walking backward. So this logic that we have here. This is how we were getting to the backward direction. And what we were doing is saying, oh, we're moving left and we're facing this direction. Now we're doing that in code, so we can clean up our states really easily. All we have to do is this. We check and see, we get the character state. Okay. So idle to walking backward, we get our character state and we check equal enum, and we check to see if this lines up with moving backward. That's simple. And then now we have to fix it in moving forward as well. So idle to walking forward, get rid of all this. In fact, you can just really get rid of this. That way you don't have to type it all in like I did. And then instead of moving right, though, we want moving forward. We want to see if the character is in that state. The AnimBP will compile again. Also important at the end here when you're setting your class defaults for each of your attacks and commands, make sure that the one input commands have a max frames between inputs of 1. It's not actually required. To my knowledge, won't hurt anything if it's greater. However, the log will print out saying that it was used multiple times or that it could be found in the command list multiple times, just because that input is still there and within the number of frames that you've given it. So if the attack ends and it can still search for another input, it will find it and say that it used it again. Even though it can't because of our logic in the previous input buffer episode, it's better to just ignore that entirely, get rid of any confusion. Okay, and now we're ready to test everything out all together. So we're going to do that right now. And what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that we can walk forward, jump backward, push our opponent, and use our attacks based off of the command list as opposed to the hard-coded state checks in our state machine prior. So you can see I can walk forward and backward. The animations are different. I know they are similar, but they are different. And I can push the opponent still. So the forward and backward logic we set up in move right and move right controller is working. Our jumps are different forward and backward, so you can see that our jumping forward, jumping backward is working regardless of the side we are on. So that also works as intended. Now the last thing, and honestly the most important, is that we can use our command lists, commands, using our new system. So I'll open up the output log, and you'll see when I'm holding backward, I can press medium to perform it. It's actually all the way at the top, so let me scroll this down so you can see in real time. And you can see we use backward medium. I can also use forward medium. So our attacks are working the same as they were before, which is excellent news. I can also use neutral medium still. But then when I flip sides, I still use backward and forward medium. So the command list is working completely as expected, and it's doing an excellent job. Now, we haven't done this part yet, but you can also do crouching logic the same way that we've done it here. So if you want to, and I'd recommend doing it, I'm going to be doing it, you go to your attacks, and then you would go and make a new command for crouching punch. you know, crouching light, crouching medium. Then you set your required state to be crouching. And then same with jumping. And if you have any like counters or parries or anything that are related to blocking, you can also use the blocking state here if you had to. One thing that you should do to basically get rid of any annoyances with this is to ignore the backward and forward dash for now. We are going to be covering more logic with dashing and running very soon as well. But for now, if you don't change it and you use this required state, it will give you some issues with startup frames, active frames, and recovery frames, because in the previous input episode where we set up all of that stuff, we did not account for dashing, and that's okay. Again, the dashing is going to have its own episode where we cover it, but so that you don't get stuck and your characters can't move or attack or anything like that for right now, I'd recommend just putting the dash is at something that couldn't possibly be done. Like, I left their inputs alone as forward, but I set the required state to be running forward and running backward. Now, we don't currently use those, so it's impossible for me to reach that, and thus I will never be able to dash if you do this. But the dashing will get fixed up, and then you'll be able to use them again in a slightly different manner. Everything will work using the same inputs that we have, but we're going to set up unique states for them, as they do have unique properties, and they shouldn't really be treated as attacks. They should be treated independently. Anyway, guys, that's all I got, so thank you so much for watching this episode. I hope it helped, and if it did, please subscribe. It does more for myself and the channel than anything else, and it's completely free. If you had any issues with this specific episode or any of the content I talked about in this episode, feel free to join the Discord community linked in the description. I'd be happy to help you out with any of the issues you had. But otherwise, I just want to give a huge shout out to my Patreon members and YouTube membership subscribers. Thank you all so much for the love and support. I really appreciate it. It helps me out more than you know. It really encourages me to continue working on these videos and get this game in a really good state for everyone to be able to use and make their own games with. But like I said, that's all I got. So thank you so much once again, and I'll see you in the next one.